Good day, everyone. I am Dainne Regis, and I am going to discuss the third part of the book Cambridge History of Literary Criticism, which is the French Revolution. Okay, so postmodernity makes it difficult to study literary and cultural history, but we still have an Enlightenment tendency to do more, to investigate and explain the inherence of literature and literary criticism to culture and history on a grand scale. The French Revolution has served as both an example of and a solution to the problem of cause and effect in culture and history. Unlike many other revolutions whose presence marks the narratives of historians and critics in terms of agricultural, industrial, demographic, consumer, and so on. So, the French Revolution seems to have had a clear beginning in 1789 and ends in 1815, if not before. Nonetheless, there was from the very first an attempt to create a single revolution by rhetorical fiat. So the French Revolution was judged to have had a very powerful consequences for European politics and political theory and for social history. One can find among the literary critics and historians judgments like that of Taine that writes that on the eve of the 19th century, the Great Modern Revolution began in Europe. Later on, Schlegel identifies the revolution as the center and apex of French national character, a symptom of what came before it rather than the origin of a new national order. So 1789's evidence is inconclusive. The revolution is significant, but how and why is left to allusion and suggestion. So changing cultures and histories are unavoidable, but they cannot be the only cause. Taine and Schlegel defined many of the norms for how literary critics think about the French Revolution and study and discuss literature following it. Few, if any, ready to relate literature to history and society said the revolution alone influenced literature. People's ideas are becoming more important to historians, and they think cultural and symbolic forms may help shape history. This corrects the misuse of political and economic revolution models. So even though 1789 was a key date in the development of what was called Romanticism, it has been more important in both an immediate and later literary critical traditions to talk about other dates that came before or after it. So in France, most agree that Romanticism originated as a conservative movement at conflict with the era's secular mentality. This has brought about a historical distancing of European Romanticism from the most important events of the French Revolution. A look at the early British Romanticism indicates it was far apart from the major French events in 1789 to 1795. So during the French Revolution, there was a big shift in how the revolution was viewed by a long-term literary history. This historiography traditionally placed major events before 1789 and regarded literature as a reaction to historical cycles rather than political developments. So using this approach, the French Revolution may still be essential in the development of modernity, but not in the development of literature. So German literary culture, on the other hand, was not yet a national thing and could be thought of as still being formed during the French Revolution. But even here, there was a lot of use of old Gothic models to figure out where it was going. So, W. Schlegel made a plea for a German literature that used events that were completely national even before there was a country, and that worked to publicize the indestructible unity of all Germans. His brother Friedrich said that the Germans would play a special role in the great internal awakening that was taking place across Europe because of a love of old traditions and romantic poetry. So he compared it to bloody revolutions. Fichte, a German philosopher, stressed the importance of the German language in bridging political divides between German-speaking nations and principalities and promoting a unique and strong relationship between words and things. So the Germans learned the appropriate approach to go ahead from the 1790s tragedies in France, but they didn't realize it. So people must acquire a new language to effect political change. So German has a primitive integrity, instant comprehensibility, and definiteness, and a force of nature quality. That is according to Fichte. Poems, vitality, and genuineness may propagate spiritual culture throughout a nation, not in a Latinate linguistic culture like France. Both Schiller's On Aesthetic Education of Man and Schille's Defense of Poetry contributed to a skeptical unsettling of any simple relation between literature and national politics, the kind that Stahl was all too often reproducing. So the Defense of Poetry is one of the masterpieces of British literary theory. So for Shelley, poetry is the radically creative energy in all of writing and culture, most apparent as itself in language, but not restricted to it. Its creativity depends upon its being free both from purposive moral or empirical intent as well as beyond the control on the of the conscious will of the poet. So poetry is to language and culture what love is interpersonal relations. Both depend upon the synthesizing energies of metaphor, bringing contraries together and turning all things to loveliness. For Shelley, the power of this poetry can be traced throughout human history, subject to temporary eclipse but never completely destroyed. So his text can be seen as a defense of the idea that poetry is progressing against the more common view, which was already somewhat traditional, that the poetry was in decline in the culture of modernization. But in the big picture of history, his arguments must be true. Culture has flourished when it has paid attention to the great poetry in it, and it has not grown when it has not. Poetry, in Shelley's broad meaning, keeps civilization alive. Poetry will live as long as we do. So rather than gradual progression, progress is created by accident. The process of explaining poetry's consequences is usually instantaneous or retroactive but not predictive. So Shelley has so preserved progress, but only by removing it from empirical history and legislative fiat. So Shelley's approach, on the other hand, worships the creative process itself, and he knows Kant's aesthetic judgment, which is strong because it is empirically and historically neutral. So in the 1790s, radicals like Godwin, Paine, and Thirlwall, as well as certain French forefathers, print would revolutionize the world. So in this manner, revolution helped create an educational system that allowed for excellent literature and the literary critic to explain the difference. Wordsworth shortened his poetry to the point that it seemed unworthy of any attention. So reading Wordsworth's poetry has always been difficult. They must find significance in seemingly unimportant things. But of course, in the secular liberal society Coleridge feared, literary education has worked to increase access to self-formation and the constructions of standards. Schiller's treatise of 1795 on naive and sentimental poetry, he said that the modern age was nostalgic for an earlier time when self-consciousness wasn't required, but he couldn't write about that time in a way that didn't require a lot of self-consciousness. So the message of a poem was less important to romantic critics than language, artistry, and overall propriety. Francis Jeffrey compares Crabbe and Goldsmith without mentioning their political views. Instead, he solely discusses aesthetics. He would now have to discuss their political ideas, which Jeffrey does not do. So Byron is a liberal merely in politics, argues that Hazlitt, his genius is haughty and aristocratic. In terms of form and aesthetics, his poetry is self-sufficient and bound by no rule except its own impulses. Because both Byron and Wordsworth are egotists. He may criticize both. Early critics and most people felt this way about Byron. And then John Wilson likened Byron to Rousseau because he reinvented himself. Jeffrey claims that none of his plays are dramatic, all of his characters are himself. Today's readers of European Romanticism typically discuss the strength of individuality as much as political principles. Wordsworth could be forced to conform into the literary culture, even if it meant sacrificing his poetry's attraction. Matthew Arnold made him a poet of nature instead of egotistical sublime. So John Morley in 1870 brilliantly understands Byron as the poet of melodramatic individualism and thus as doubly threatening to the emerging culture of literary criticism and its pedagogically normalizing ambitions. People who claim that ideas and metaphysics caused the French Revolution frequently blame their own irrational views. This picture of the French Revolution appears to have reinforced existing biases and assumptions, a significant desire to keep literature and its critic free from systems, ideas, and ideologies, as well as technical words existed in Britain. So, Edward Gibbon said, "I dislike those who were fond of systems and ignored the nuances of literature and criticism because they were dedicated to the human heart and the pictures nature has to give us," he stated. Then there's the continuous dispute over literary theory. During the Revolution, literature and theory battled it out. The theory didn't have a chance since the British saw it as a French thing. Literature's meaning and purpose were confirmed as more local and distinctive after 1789. For Hazlitt, literature in general and dramatic poetry in particular offer the best means for tempting the public away from its preoccupation with the French Revolution and its consequences. The most challenging and peculiar circumstances come to mind while reading dramatic poetry, as well as personal and local attachments and hostility. Byron and Wordsworth are too self-important to be specific, so they can't be detailed because Godwin's theoretical fixation and the 1790s Jacobin fiction. Throughout the 18th century, the concept that literature was a career for women grew. Women were creating more and more literature, and since it was written in English and was simple to grasp, more women read it. So to write literature well requires the finest sense of character and manners. Heman's translation of foreign literature are praised for bringing to English the grandiose and revolting notions of other civilizations. This is helpful since it helps normalize culture. In Burke's instance, unauthorized ladies created the magnificent spectacle. Women like Hemans might help prevent it in the future. This gender decision this gender decision helped enhance the overall feminine role of that culture in connection to the growth of scientific, utilitarian, and professional occupations, which were growing more widespread. These two may be linked to but not only caused by the French Revolution. So, how then to sum up the impact of the French Revolution on Romantic literary criticism? So, people in most places thought that revolution was a good thing, even though it broke with the past, except in France, where many thought it was a big change. Confirmed that British literature would be an anti-metropolitan and rural because the revolution was depicted as a Parisian event. It also probably helped to make sure that women were important in a culture that valued the purity of heartfelt feelings and personal integrity above all else. So for these reasons, among others, it would be hard to argue that the French Revolution has even now finished its work with literary criticism. So that's the end of my discussion. Thank you.